My name is Josephine Calloway, and before I tell you what happened at my father's memorial gala, I want you to imagine something. Imagine spending 18 years building a life with a man who chose you, who signed the papers, who sat up with you through every fever and every failed exam. And then, 3 days after his funeral, watching strangers with his blood in their veins try to prove, in a room full of 500 people, that you were never really his daughter at all. That happened to me on a rainy October evening at the Calloway Foundation's annual charity gala, 6 weeks after my father, Nathaniel Calloway, passed away. My biological uncle stood up at the podium, in front of the entire board of directors, half of Silicon Valley's old guard, and a room full of cameras, and announced that my adoption had never been properly finalized, that the company my father built from a garage workshop into a billion-dollar robotics empire should pass by blood to him instead. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I picked up the microphone myself and made one phone call. 40 minutes later, a woman walked through those ballroom doors carrying a single manila folder, and when my uncle saw her face, he actually stumbled backward into the podium. Before I go further, if stories about chosen family, hidden truths, and people underestimating quiet women hit close to home for you, stay with me, because this one gets worse before it gets better. Let me take you back to where it actually started, 18 years before that gala, on a freezing February morning in a county courthouse in Ohio. I was 8 years old when Nathaniel Calloway adopted me. I'd been in the foster system for 2 years by then, shuffled between 3 different homes after my biological mother's parental rights were terminated, not because anyone hated me, but because addiction had taken more from her than she had left to give. I don't remember much from those years except cold hallways and the particular kind of loneliness that settles into a child who's learned not to unpack her bags, because she knows she won't be staying. Nathaniel wasn't what anyone expected of an adoptive father. He was 44, unmarried, already wealthy from selling his first robotics patent to an industrial manufacturer, and about as socially awkward as a man could be while still running board meetings. He'd never planned on children. He told me once, years later, that he'd walked into that foster agency intending to make a donation, and instead ended up filling out paperwork because a caseworker mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there was a quiet 8-year-old girl who'd been overlooked for adoption 3 times because she didn't smile enough for the family photos. "You didn't need to smile for me," he told me, the day he explained all this. "I just needed someone who'd actually look at the blueprints when I talked about them instead of pretending to be interested." That was Nathaniel. Awkward, blunt, and somehow exactly what I needed. I still remember the first night in his house, sitting cross-legged on an unfamiliar bed in a room that smelled like fresh paint, waiting for the door to lock the way it always had at the last foster placement. Some rule about checking on kids at night that always felt more like a cage than care. Instead, I heard him pause outside my door, hesitate, and then knock, softly, actually knock, before asking if I wanted the hallway light left on. Nobody had ever asked me that before. I said yes, and he left it on every night for the next 4 years until I finally told him at 12 that I didn't need it anymore. I grew up in his sprawling, cluttered house outside Columbus, surrounded by half-finished prototypes and whiteboards full of equations I didn't understand until I was 16. He taught me to solder before he taught me to drive. Our early years together were awkward in the specific way that 2 people learning an entirely new language together are awkward. He'd never parented, and I'd learned, in foster care, not to trust adults who smiled too easily. We found our rhythm slowly, over burnt pancakes on Saturday mornings and long, silent car rides to school where neither of us felt any pressure to fill the quiet. I remember the first time I called him Dad instead of Nathaniel. I was 11, and I'd fallen off my bike hard enough to split my chin open, and he'd driven me to the emergency room white-knuckled and terrified in a way I'd never seen from him, and somewhere between the waiting room and the stitches, the word just slipped out. He didn't make a thing of it. He just nodded once, like I'd confirmed something he already suspected, and asked if I wanted ice cream on the way home even though it was 11 at night. There was another moment, smaller but somehow more telling, that I think about often now. I was 12, and a girl at school had found out, through some careless comment from a teacher, that I was adopted, and had spent an entire week making sure the rest of my class knew it too, dropping the word orphan into conversations just loud enough for me to hear. I came home that Friday and told Nathaniel I didn't want to go back. He listened the whole story without interrupting once, which was rare for him, because he interrupted everyone, mid-sentence, mid-meeting. It was practically his signature. When I finished, he set down the schematic he'd been holding, looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're not an orphan, Josephine. An orphan is a status. You're my daughter. That's a fact. Facts don't care what a 12-year-old with nothing better to do thinks about them." Then he drove me to school himself on Monday, walked me to homeroom in front of everyone, shook the teacher's hand, and left without further comment. Nobody said the word orphan to me again after that. He never remarried. He never had other biological children. And on the rare occasions his extended family surfaced, a brother named Preston who lived 3 states away and called twice a year, always around tax season. The conversations were stiff, transactional, entirely about company shares and board seats. Never about me. Preston Calloway had been cut out of Nathaniel's decades earlier, back when the two brothers had a falling out over Preston's failed attempt to embezzle from their late father's small manufacturing business. Nathaniel rarely spoke about it, but the one time he did, sitting on our back porch when I was maybe 17, he said something I never forgot. "Preston's the kind of man who thinks loyalty is something you're owed by blood, instead of something you earn by showing up. I stopped waiting for him to show up a long time ago." I finished my engineering degree at his old university, joined the company's product design division under a different last name at first. Calloway was too recognizable, and I wanted to earn my position rather than have it handed to me. And eventually, 3 years before he died, became Chief Design Officer, a title the board approved unanimously, without knowing, until later, that the quiet young woman who'd redesigned their flagship prosthetic limb technology was Nathaniel's daughter. Those years running product design alongside him were, looking back, the best of my life. We'd argue over torque calculations in front of engineers twice our age, and he'd back down exactly 0% of the time even when I was right, purely out of principle, and then quietly implement my version anyway a week later without ever admitting I'd won. I dated occasionally during those years, nothing that ever felt permanent, mostly because I think I measured every man I met against a standard of quiet, stubborn loyalty that Nathaniel had set so high it was hard for anyone else to clear it. There was one relationship that mattered more than the others, with a structural engineer named Desmond Ruiz who worked 2 floors below me on the manufacturing side. He'd met over a disagreement about weight distribution in a prosthetic knee joint, of all things, and somehow that argument turned into dinner, and dinner turned into 2 years of something steady and unhurried. Desmond never once asked me about the company's valuation or what I stood to inherit. He asked about my design sketches, and whether I'd eaten lunch, and once, memorably, whether I thought Nathaniel would ever stop calling him, the young man, even after we'd been together for over a year. Nathaniel's approval, when it finally came, arrived in the most Nathaniel way possible. About 8 months into dating Desmond, I brought him to a Sunday shop session, mostly out of curiosity to see how he'd react to 2 hours of soldering and half-finished prototypes instead of a normal dinner. Desmond, without any prompting, immediately noticed a flaw in the tensioning mechanism Nathaniel had been fighting with for weeks, something about the housing material warping under repeated stress cycles, and fixed it in about 20 minutes using a spare bracket from a bin of scrap parts. Nathaniel didn't say anything that day. He just started including Desmond in shop time going forward, without ever formally inviting him, the way you'd assume a standing appointment rather than announce one. Desmond told me later that was the moment he understood he'd been accepted, because Nathaniel handing you tools without asking was apparently the closest thing to a blessing the man was capable of giving. Desmond was there, quietly, through everything that followed. Nathaniel was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer 8 months before he passed. He spent those final months doing exactly what you'd expect a stubborn engineer to do, obsessively organizing his affairs, revising legal documents, and as I'd learn only after his death, quietly consulting with an old family friend named Odette Marchetti, a retired federal judge turned private legal consultant who specialized in exactly the kind of inheritance disputes he apparently suspected were coming. He never told me about those meetings. I only found out because Odette herself told me, on the worst night of my life, 4 months after his funeral. There's a stretch of my childhood with Nathaniel I haven't told you about yet, because it matters for understanding why Preston's ambush failed so completely, and why the board turned on him so fast once Odette walked through those doors. I was 13 when Nathaniel first let me sit in on an actual board meeting, not to participate, just to observe from a chair in the corner while men twice his age argued about manufacturing costs. He told me afterward, driving home, that he wanted me to understand early that boardrooms were just rooms where people negotiated. Nothing magical about them, nothing I should ever feel intimidated by. I didn't understand yet why that lesson mattered so much to him. I understood completely, decades later, standing at that podium in front of 500 people, my hands steady because a stubborn engineer had spent years teaching a scared, quiet foster kid that rooms full of powerful people were still just rooms. He was, in his own way, relentlessly consistent about making sure I never felt like an afterthought in his life, even when the company demanded most of his time. Every Sunday, without exception, for as long as I lived under his roof, we had what he called shop time. 2 or 3 hours in his garage workshop, where he'd let me help with whatever prototype he was tinkering with that week, regardless of how far behind schedule the actual company projects were running. I later found out from his longtime assistant that he'd turned down 2 international speaking engagements during my high school years specifically because they conflicted with a Sunday. That consistency became the foundation of the trust that made everything Odette later did possible. Nathaniel never once, in 18 years, gave me reason to doubt that my place in his life was permanent and unconditional, and that certainty is exactly what let me stand in that ballroom and refuse to be shaken by Preston's accusation, because some part of me had known, long before any lawyer confirmed it, that the paperwork had never been the real foundation of my claim to that family. He was. I should back up further, because to understand why what happened at that gala failed so completely, you need to understand exactly how much preparation went into stopping it, months before I even knew there was anything to stop. Nathaniel's diagnosis came on a Tuesday in February, delivered by an oncologist who used the word aggressive 3 times in the same sentence. I remember driving him home from that appointment, both of us silent for almost the entire hour, until he finally said, staring out the passenger window, "I need you to understand something about your uncle before this gets complicated." He told me, for the first time in any real detail, about growing up with Preston in a cramped house outside Dayton, about how their father had run a small precision machining shop that barely survived 2 recessions, and about how Preston, even as a teenager, had a particular talent for making other people's effort look like his own. He convinced our father to sign over partial ownership of the shop to him when he was 23, Nathaniel said. Told him it was for tax purposes. Within 2 years, he drained the operating accounts and left Dad to explain the shortfall to the bank. I was the one who bailed it out. Preston never apologized. He just found a new angle. That was the first time Nathaniel told me he suspected Preston might resurface once he was gone. Not out of love, not out of any real relationship with either of us, but because a company worth what ours was worth represented. To Preston, exactly the kind of opportunity he'd spent his whole life chasing and never quite achieving on his own. He told me the story of the company's founding that same afternoon, a story he rarely repeated in full, usually preferring the shorthand version he gave investors. He'd started in a rented garage outside Dayton at 26, living on canned soup and a single line of credit, building an early prototype for a robotic assembly arm that every manufacturer he pitched it to initially turned down. The breakthrough came almost by accident, a chance meeting at a trade show with a prosthetics researcher who saw an entirely different application for the same underlying technology, precision movement, that could be adapted for artificial limbs rather than factory assembly lines. Nathaniel spent the next 3 years redesigning everything around that single insight, mortgaging the garage itself twice to keep the lights on, before the first commercial prosthetic joint using his design finally reached the market and changed everything almost overnight. "I built that company with nothing," he told me. "No family money, no family help, just work. Your uncle watched me do it from 3 states away and never once offered to help, not with money, Not with time, nothing. But the moment there was something worth having, he suddenly remembered we were brothers. He'd paused there, looking out at the yard, and added something that stuck with me long after. People like Preston don't want to build things, Josephine. They want to already have built them. There's a difference, and it's the only difference that's ever mattered to me. Within 2 weeks of that diagnosis, Nathaniel had contacted Odette Marchetti, whom he'd known for almost 20 years through a mutual friend on a nonprofit board. Odette had spent 3 decades as a federal judge before retiring into private legal consulting, specializing, almost exclusively by that point in her career, in exactly the kind of inheritance disputes wealthy families generate when a patriarch dies and distant relatives smell opportunity. He came to my office with a legal pad full of questions, Odette told me later, once everything had settled. Not questions about how to protect his money, questions about how to protect you specifically. He wanted to know what kind of challenge someone could realistically bring against an adoption that old, what kind of technicality Preston might try to exploit, and how to make absolutely certain that no such technicality actually existed by the time he passed. What followed, over the next several months, was a quiet, methodical process that I never once witnessed, because Nathaniel deliberately kept me out of it. He didn't want me spending what remained of his life managing legal contingencies instead of just being with him. Odette pulled the original adoption file from the Ohio County Courthouse and had it independently reviewed by 2 separate adoption law specialists, neither aware of the other's involvement, specifically to rule out any possibility that the filing itself contained an error Preston might later exploit. Both confirmed the adoption was complete, properly consented to, and airtight under state law. Odette also did something Nathaniel almost didn't want done, though he authorized it in the end. She hired a private investigator to quietly monitor Preston's activities in the months following the diagnosis becoming known within certain business circles, not out of paranoia, but because Nathaniel's instincts about his brother had never once been wrong in 40 years. That investigator's reports, it would turn out, became crucial. Within 3 months, Preston had made 2 separate inquiries to genealogy and legal records services attempting to access sealed juvenile adoption records. Inquiries that, on their own, meant very little. But that, combined with everything else, painted an unmistakable picture of a man already building a case before his brother was even in the ground. The investigator. A methodical former paralegal named Corbin Alvarez, who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet corporate surveillance, later explained to me, once everything had settled, exactly how the picture had come together piece by piece. Preston had first reached out to a genealogy research firm in Columbus under a fabricated pretext, claiming he was compiling a family history project, and requested copies of any court filings related to changes in family structure going back 2 decades. When that inquiry returned incomplete results, sealed juvenile records being exactly that, sealed, he'd escalated to a records broker who specialized, according to Corbin's report, in expedited retrieval services that operated in a legal gray area most people never encountered. That second inquiry is what worried your father most, Corbin told me. The first one could be explained away as innocent curiosity. The second one meant he already knew the records were sealed and was actively looking for someone willing to bypass that. Corbin's surveillance also picked up something else, something Nathaniel apparently found almost more painful than the records' inquiries themselves. Preston had begun quietly reaching out to 2 former Calloway board members who'd retired years earlier, both of whom still held small residual stakes in the company, testing, in vague hypothetical terms, how they might feel about family continuity concerns should anything happen to Nathaniel. Neither retired board member took the conversations seriously enough to report them at the time, dismissing Preston as simply anxious about his brother's health. It was only after the gala, when Corbin's full report became part of the estate's documentation, that both of them contacted Odette independently to confirm the conversations had, in fact, happened almost exactly as described. Nathaniel recorded a formal video statement 2 months before he passed, sitting upright in his study, the same study where he'd once taught me to solder, statting clearly and deliberately. For the legal record, that he anticipated a challenge to my inheritance specifically from his brother Preston, and reaffirming, in explicit and unambiguous terms, his wishes regarding the company, the estate, and my position as his legal and only daughter. He never showed me that recording. I only saw it, for the first time, the same night everything came apart at the gala. The funeral was small and quiet, exactly the way he would have wanted it. No press, no board members giving speeches about visionary leadership, just close colleagues and the small circle of people who'd actually known him rather than his company's stock price. Preston attended, dressed impeccably, offering a handshake and a condolence so smooth it barely registered as sincere. He didn't stay for the reception afterward. Desmond stood beside me through the entire service, saying almost nothing, which was exactly what I needed. I assumed, foolishly, that would be the end of it. 6 weeks later, the Calloway Foundation held its annual charity gala, an event Nathaniel had established years earlier to fund robotics education programs in underserved schools, held every October at the Whitmore Grand Hotel downtown. The board had debated canceling it out of respect, but ultimately decided Nathaniel would have wanted it to continue, and I agreed, mostly because the scholarship recipients that year included 3 kids from foster care programs, kids who reminded me, uncomfortably, of myself at 8 years old. I didn't expect Preston to attend. I certainly didn't expect what he'd planned. The ballroom that night held roughly 500 guests, board members, investors, city officials, journalists covering the tech sector, and a scattering of foundation donors in gowns that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. I gave a short speech honoring my father's legacy, thanked the scholarship donors, and had just stepped down from the podium when Preston Calloway rose from his seat near the front, unbuttoned his jacket, and asked, in a voice pitched deliberately to Carrie, whether he might add a brief family note before the evening continued. The board chair, unaware of what was coming, gestured him toward the microphone. "I want to first say how much I loved my brother," Preston began, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach immediately, because I recognized, even before he continued, the particular tone of a man performing grief he didn't feel for an audience he'd calculated carefully. But I also believe, in his memory, that certain truths need to be addressed honestly, rather than quietly buried along with him. He turned toward me, and 500 faces followed his gaze. "Josephine has served this company faithfully, and I don't dispute her talent. But I've recently had reason to review the original adoption filing from 18 years ago, and I believe there's a significant legal irregularity, one that means her adoption was never properly finalized under Ohio state law, due to a missing secondary consent signature from her biological mother's court-appointed representative at the time." Room went utterly silent, the kind of silence that has weight. "If that's accurate," Preston continued, his voice gaining confidence as the shock rippled through the crowd, "then Josephine has no legal claim to Nathaniel's estate, including his controlling shares in this company, which would then pass, under our father's original family trust, to me as his only living blood relative." Stood there under the chandeliers, 500 people staring at me, feeling 18 years of my life reduced, in front of cameras, to a footnote about missing paperwork. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera's flash went off. My ears started ringing, the specific high whine that happens right before your body decides whether to fight or run. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Someone near the back audibly gasped. A board member I'd known for a decade wouldn't meet my eyes. I understood with sudden clarity exactly what this was. Not grief. Not a genuine legal concern. A calculated ambush, staged specifically for an audience large enough to make retraction humiliating regardless of what came next. I didn't cry. I didn't argue with him in front of the room, though everything in me wanted to. I walked back to the podium, took the microphone from the stunned board chair, and said, as steadily as I could manage, "If you're questioning the legitimacy of a legal adoption finalized 18 years ago, Preston, I'd suggest we let the actual documentation speak for itself, rather than your memory of it." Then, I did the only thing I could think to do. I stepped away from the podium, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number Nathaniel had given me only once, almost a year earlier, tucked inside a birthday card with no explanation beyond a handwritten note that said, "If anyone ever questions where you came from, call her." Det Marchetti answered on the second ring. "Josephine," she said, before I'd even explained anything. Tell me he made his move. How did you know? Because your father spent the last 8 months of his life preparing for exactly this conversation. I have everything you need. I can be there in 40 minutes. I stood in a side hallway of the Whitmore Grand for the longest 40 minutes of my life, Desmond standing silently beside me the entire time, his hand steady on my shoulder, listening to the muffled sound of 500 guests speculating in the ballroom behind us, before the side doors opened and Odette Marchetti walked in, silver-haired, unhurried, carrying a single manila folder like it weighed nothing at all. Though I would soon learn it contained enough to end Preston Calloway's ambitions permanently, she walked straight past me into the ballroom, and I followed her back toward the podium, my heart hammering. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice carrying easily across the room without any need for amplification, the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years commanding courtrooms. "I believe you and I need to have a conversation in front of everyone here since you've chosen to make this public." Preston's confident expression faltered the instant he recognized her. "Judge Marchetti," he said carefully, "I wasn't aware you were involved in this. I was retained by your brother 8 months before his death, specifically because he suspected you'd attempt something exactly like this the moment he was gone." She opened the folder. "The original adoption filing you referenced is complete and was properly finalized in county court 18 years ago. I have the certified original here, along with the notarized consent documentation you claim is missing, which was in fact filed correctly and has simply never been part of any record you had legitimate access to." The room, which had gone deathly quiet during Preston's opening accusation, now buzzed with a different, sharper energy. "More importantly," Odette continued, withdrawing a second document, "your brother anticipated you might attempt to challenge the estate through exactly this kind of manufactured legal technicality. 8 months ago, he had 2 independent legal experts review the entire adoption record specifically to rule out any future challenge. Both confirmed its validity beyond dispute. He also recorded a formal video statement, notarized and time-stamped, explicitly nomming you as someone he expected might attempt to contest Josephine's inheritance and explicitly reaffirming his intentions." Preston's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence visibly draining by the second. His hand, still gripping the edge of the podium, was shaking now, just slightly, and I watched a man who'd walked in 20 minutes earlier like he already owned the room realize, in real time, that the room had just turned against him completely. He started. "This is a private family matter. This doesn't need to be litigated in a ballroom." "You made it a ballroom matter the moment you stood at that podium," Odette said, not unkindly, but without any give in her voice either. "I'd also note, for the benefit of everyone here, that your brother's estate attorney flagged an attempt 6 weeks ago, shortly after the funeral, to access sealed adoption records through a private investigator hired under a false pretext. That attempt has already been reported to the county records office as a potential violation of confidentiality statutes protecting juvenile court records." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and I watched several board members exchange uncomfortable glances, clearly recalculating, in real time, whatever loyalty or curiosity Preston's accusation had briefly earned him. Preston opened his mouth once more, but nothing came out. There was nothing left to say. He'd staged a public reckoning meant to humiliate me into surrendering something that was never actually in question, and instead, he'd handed the entire room evidence of his own attempt at fraud. I took the microphone one final time, my hand steadier than I expected. "My father chose me when I was 8 years old, in a courthouse in Ohio, with no obligation and no expectation of anything in return. Everything I've built since then, I built because he taught me to. Tonight doesn't change that. It just makes it a matter of public record." Preston left the ballroom quietly, without another word, trailed by whispers that followed him all the way to the exit. The weeks that followed unfolded with the particular quiet ruthlessness of institutions doing exactly what they're built to do. The county records office confirmed within days that Preston's private investigator had indeed accessed sealed juvenile records through fraudulent pretenses, opening a legal exposure of his own that made any further contest of the estate not just unlikely, but actively dangerous for him to pursue. Preston's own attorney, a corporate litigator who'd apparently agreed to the engagement without fully understanding what he was walking into, withdrew from representing him less than 2 weeks later, citing, according to a mutual industry contact, irreconcilable concerns about the underlying facts. Board convened an emergency session 8 days after the gala, not to discuss Preston's claim, which had already collapsed under its own weight, but to formally address the reputational fallout from having one of the industry's most public inheritance disputes play out in front of half of Silicon Valley's press corps. I sat through that meeting expecting scrutiny of my own position. Instead, board member after board member spent the session expressing quiet embarrassment that they'd allowed Preston anywhere near a microphone in the first place, and the board voted unanimously to formally and publicly reaffirm my position as CEO designate, a transition Nathaniel had already begun quietly arranging before his death, releasing a statement that specifically praised my composure and leadership under an ambush none of them had anticipated. The press coverage in the days immediately following the gala was its own strange trial by fire. A junior tech reporter who'd been covering the event for a business outlet had captured most of Preston's speech on her phone, and by the following morning, the clip had circulated widely enough that I woke up to over 200 messages, some from old classmates I hadn't spoken to in a decade, some from journalists requesting comment, a handful from people who seemed to think the drama entitled them to insight into a stranger's private grief. I didn't respond to any press requests directly. Odette handled that, issuing a single measured statement on behalf of the estate confirming the adoption's full legal validity, and nodding, pointedly, that any further inquiries regarding Preston Calloway's conduct should be directed to the appropriate authorities rather than the family. What surprised me most wasn't the volume of coverage, but its tone. I'd braced myself for speculation, for some outlet trying to spin the story into a scandal about hidden family secrets. Instead, most of the coverage that followed focused on something else entirely, the quiet, methodical way Nathaniel had spent his final months protecting someone he loved, and the contrast between that kind of devotion and Preston's transparent opportunism. One columnist, writing for a regional business publication, described the gala as a masterclass in exactly how little blood matters when love has already made its case. A line that I found taped inside my desk drawer months later, apparently left there by an assistant who thought I should see it again on harder days. Not everyone was kind. A handful of anonymous commenters online seized on the story to make ugly, baseless speculation about my background, about foster care generally, about whether wealthy men, collecting children was somehow suspicious in itself. Comments that Desmond eventually made me promise to stop reading after he caught me scrolling through them at 2 a.m, jaw tight, unable to look away. He was right to make me stop. Some fights aren't worth having, and arguing with strangers who'd already decided what they believed about people like me was never going to be one I could win by engaging. A financial crimes attorney representing the estate later confirmed, in a private briefing I sat in on, that Preston's private investigators' records access alone carried potential criminal exposure under Ohio statutes protecting sealed juvenile court records, exposure serious enough that Preston's new attorney reportedly advised him, in no uncertain terms, that pursuing any further legal challenge to the adoption or the estate would only invite additional scrutiny into exactly how he'd obtained the information he'd used at the gala in the first place. That briefing was the first time I heard the full timeline laid out end to end, and sitting in that conference room listening to it, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not vindication exactly. More like watching a slow-motion replay of a car crash you'd already survived, understanding for the first time just how close it had actually come to going differently. The attorney explained that Preston had, in fact, drafted a formal legal complaint 6 weeks before the gala, ready to file the moment he believed he had sufficient documentation, and had only held off because his original attorney advised him the adoption records alone wouldn't be enough without a public spectacle to pressure a quick settlement. That was the strategy all along, not a courtroom battle, a humiliation loud enough that I'd sign something just to make it stop. Knowing that made the whole evening click into place differently. Preston hadn't miscalculated by choosing the gala. He'd chosen it deliberately, correctly assuming that most people, faced with that kind of public exposure, would rather concede quietly than fight publicly. He simply hadn't accounted for the fact that Nathaniel had spent 8 months making sure I'd never have to make that choice alone. Preston never filed anything. The threat that had loomed over those first 6 weeks after the funeral simply evaporated, the way threats built entirely on bluff tend to when someone finally calls them. I didn't see Preston again for almost a year, until a mutual industry acquaintance mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd relocated out of state and quietly stepped back from any public involvement in business circles that had once known him as Nathaniel Calloway's brother. I felt, when I heard that, less satisfaction than I expected. Mostly I just felt tired and a little sad, in the particular way you feel sad for a person who spent his entire life chasing something he was never actually capable of earning honestly. The months after the gala were strange ones, filled with a kind of quiet, deliberate rebuilding that I hadn't expected grief to require. I threw myself into the company's foster care scholarship program, expanding it that following spring to fund not just tuition, but mentorship pairings between engineering students and working professionals, something Nathaniel had talked about doing for years, but never quite gotten around to. I met the first cohort of scholarship recipients in person that June, 6 kids between 14 and 17, all of them in foster care, all of them curious and guarded in ways I recognized instantly. And I found myself, for the first time since the funeral, genuinely looking forward to something. Desmond proposed the following spring, on the same back porch where Nathaniel had once told me about Preston's history. No dramatic gesture, no audience, just the two of us and a ring he'd apparently been carrying around in his jacket pocket for 3 weeks trying to find the right moment. I said yes before he even finished the question, which he still brings up, almost a year later, as evidence that I ruined his carefully planned speech. Desmond, through all of this, remained exactly the steady presence he'd always been. He never once suggested I should feel guilty about how thoroughly Preston's life had unraveled, but he also never let me wallow in whatever residual guilt I did feel, usually by reminding me, in his characteristically blunt engineering way, that Preston had built the entire collapse himself, brick by brick, over 8 months of deliberate scheming, and that gravity isn't cruelty just because it's consistent. We married the following autumn, almost exactly 2 years after Nathaniel's death, in a small ceremony at the same lake house upstate, where Nathaniel used to take me fishing every August. I asked one of the foundation's scholarship recipients, a 16-year-old named Aaliyah who'd become something like a little sister to me over the preceding year, to be part of the wedding party, and watching her stand there in a borrowed dress, laughing with people who'd become, gradually, her chosen family too, felt like the truest possible tribute to everything Nathaniel had actually believed about what makes a family real. The ceremony itself stayed small on purpose, just under 60 guests, mostly colleagues who'd become genuine friends over the years, and a handful of foundation scholarship kids who'd, without my really planning it, become something like an extended family of their own. Odette Marchetti attended, seated in the front row beside Corbin Alvarez, the investigator, the two of them having apparently kept in touch since the gala and developed an odd, comfortable friendship built entirely around their shared role in dismantling Preston's scheme. Odette gave a short, characteristically blunt toast at the reception that made half the room laugh and the other half tear up. Something about how the law exists to protect people who can't always protect themselves, and how Nathaniel Calloway had spent his final months making absolutely certain his daughter would never need anyone else to do that for her again. I still run the company today. I still keep his old whiteboard in my office, equations and all, and some evenings, when the building empties out, I sit at my desk and think about a caseworker's throwaway comment 18 years ago, about a quiet girl who didn't smile enough for family photos, and about a man who decided that was reason enough to choose her anyway. The foster care scholarship program has grown considerably since that first cohort of 6 kids. We're up to nearly 40 now, spread across 3 states, each paired with an engineer or designer willing to give a few hours a month, not to lecture, just to show up consistently, the way Nathaniel once showed up for me. I make a point of meeting every new cohort personally, and every single time, I find myself scanning their faces for that particular guardedness I remember so well from my own childhood, the look of a kid who's learned not to unpack her bags. Most of them still have it at first. Most of them lose a little of it by the end of the year, which is, I think, the entire point. Aaliyah, the girl who stood in my wedding party, graduated with an engineering degree of her own last spring, and asked me, half joking, half serious, whether the company might have an opening for her once she finished her master's. I told her the shop time offer still stood, Sundays, no exceptions, and she laughed the way you laugh when you understand a joke is only half a joke. I think about him almost every day, still, usually in small moments rather than large ones. The particular way he cleared his throat before saying something he thought was important. The whiteboard equations I've never quite understood but refuse to erase. The birthday card with Odette's number tucked inside, no explanation given, because he trusted that if I ever needed it, I'd know exactly what to do. I did. And she came. Sometimes, late at night, I still catch myself reaching for my phone to tell him something, some small win at the office, some ridiculous thing Desmond did before remembering all over again that he's not there to answer. Grief doesn't really end. It just gets quieter, the way a workshop goes quiet after the machines shut down for the night, but the smell of the work never fully leaves the room. Family, I've learned, was never about blood in my life. It was about who actually shows up. And no amount of paperwork, real or manufactured, was ever going to change that. If this story reminded you that chosen family is still family, and that the people who show up matter more than the people who share your blood, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.